Hi, this is Christine with Zeidman Development. Today I'd like to walk you through a sample import of grateful patient data into the Razor's Edge using Importacular. For the purposes of this sample, we'll be using three of our paid destinations: Solicitor, Actions, and Prospect. We'll import the patient's solicitor, a relationship between the patient and the solicitor, an action detailing the patient's hospital visit. As a side note, make sure you're always HIPAA compliant with what information you enter into Razor's Edge. And a follow-up action so that the solicitor remembers to send a card to the patient, as well as prospect information, including ratings, financial information, and the patient's area of interest as indicated from the records in your Grateful Patient program. I've already got a template set up, so let's go ahead and take a quick look. You can see on the first tab of my mapping template that I have a mapping for my constituent, and in this case my constituent is my patient. I have a mapping for a constituent attribute that's linked to my constituent, and that attribute is called origin. It's how we're tracking where our constituents are being imported into Razor's Edge from. And finally, you can see that I have a constituent mapping for a solicitor. That mapping is a slightly lighter color of gray. That's because that mapping has actually come from our Solicitor tab, but we can see it on our Constituent tab because it does create a constituent record in Razor's Edge. While we do cover the creation of constituents and solicitors in other screencasts, I do want to touch on them briefly here today. When we open our constituent, we can see that the constituent has been mapped to first name, last name, and we've also assigned an addressee and a salutation. If we had the information available, we could also add things like title, suffix, nickname, middle name, gender, or any of these other fields that are available here. You can also see here that I've mapped a constituent attribute. This attribute is linked to the patient constituent, not the solicitor constituent, and it tracks the origin of where this record was created from. You can see that here because the import is linked to constituent, not solicitor, and you can see our category as well as the other information that we've added here. In order to view the constituent record we're creating for the solicitor, we need to go to the Solicitor tab. Here you can see our Solicitor Record. This looks very much like our constituent record, but the main difference is this row here for constituent is solicitor is automatically in a gray box. Also, just as a note, because we had first name in our data source, this was automatically mapped to say first name. We had to change it so that it would say solicitor first name. If you have both the constituent and the solicitor in the same file, always double check and make sure that you've linked the correct fields. I've also mapped a solicitor relationship between my patient and solicitor. You can see here that I've added the date from as being the hospital visit date. I've added in the notes that this is from the hospital visit, and I've assigned a solicitor type. If I wanted to add an amount, an appeal, a campaign, or a fund ID, I could do that as well. In my data transformations, I've set this to only add the new solicitor if no existing match is found, and I'm trusting the system to match on just the solicitor's name. I'm not concerned if they have the same solicitor with any other information. I just want to know that we don't add the same constituent and solicitor relationship twice. Since we've looked at the solicitor and the constituent, as well as the relationship between the two, the next step is to look at our Actions tab. You can see on our Actions tab that I've actually mapped two separate actions. I have an action for the hospital visit, and I have an action for the hospital visit follow-up. I've assigned the solicitor to both of those things, but I've also added an attribute and a notepad to my hospital visit. Let's start by looking at the hospital visit mapping. On my hospital visit mapping, I have used the hospital visit date as my action date. I have marked that this was a meeting as my category, and I've marked that it was completed. I've also used my hospital visit date as my completed date. And I have filled in my status as completed and my type as visit. I've made sure that I've addressed all of my required fields, and I've filled in everything that's required by my organization. You may need additional fields, but this is all that I need. I have also linked this hospital visit to the constituent as compared to the solicitor. I do have that choice in this dropdown. You need to be sure that you assign the action on the record that it should exist on. For my organization, I want the visit to show up on the constituent's record, not on the solicitor's record. So that's why I've linked it to the constituent. You can also see that I've added an action attribute to go with my hospital visit. I've created this attribute so that I can show the hospital wing that each patient was in. I want to add my date, so let's do that here. And I also have a field in my data file for hospital wing. So you can see this way we're able to go back and look at our action and see which hospital wing our patient was in. I've also added a setting to this field so that I'm only adding this attribute when nothing else exists that matches it. Next, you can see I've added a note. I've used the visit notes from my file. I've used the hospital visit date from my file. I've added hospital visit, and I've added the type of visit notes. You can see here that I had to choose which of my actions I wanted to link this to, and I'm listing it to the visit and not the follow-up. Next, you can see that I have my hospital visit solicitor. When I created my mapping, the only option I had here was to choose the solicitor, and there's only one option because I've only created one solicitor, and to choose my action. I've chosen the hospital visit because this is the visit that the solicitor went on. Once I created my hospital visit action and all of the pieces that went with it, I created a second action for the hospital visit follow-up. In this example, we're assuming that our solicitors are going to send a card or a mailing to our patients about 2 weeks after the hospital visit. So in order to create a transformation, I've done the following. I added the hospital visit date here, but I don't want the action to be dated for the hospital visit date. I want it to be set for 2 weeks in the future. So I've added the option here of the dynamic date, use source date plus 15 days. That will enable me to schedule these actions into the future. I've also left my completed date as blank because these are future actions that have yet to be completed. I've added a letter code of follow-up because that's the code that my organization has chosen to use. And I've also added the type of follow-up because this is the follow-up on the hospital visit. Next, in order to make sure that we have this assigned to the correct solicitor, I've created a solicitor mapping. This looks exactly the same as the other one, except I've linked it to this action instead of the other action. So we have the same solicitor linked to both actions. One of the actions is completed, the other action is in the future. Next, let's take a look at our prospect tab. You can see that we've mapped ratings, financial information, interest, and prospect status. Let's take a look at our ratings first. I did have all of the fields I needed in my source file. I had a prospect rating category. I had a date of my hospital visit date. I had a rating description, a rating note, and a rating source. I could have used a default value, but for this I didn't need to. Next, let's look at our financial information. I did have all of these fields in my file as well. I had my financial information amount. I had my financial information acquired. I had my financial information source. I had my financial information type. And I had my financial information notes. I could have added something in a default value here as well, but again, I did not have that need. When we look at our interest code, we had the opportunity to map something that the patient is interested in. For the purposes of this, we had an interest file in our data source. You can see that mapped here to the interest code. We could have also added a comment, but we didn't have a need to in this file. Finally, we've taken the opportunity to map this patient to prospect status. So we've given a prospect classification as well as a prospect status so that we can track how this patient should be solicited and where they are in the pipeline. Thank you so much for watching this video showing 3 of the different areas that you can use in Importacular in order to import Grateful patient programs into the Razor's Edge. You could also add other categories such as individual relationships to import spouses, organization relationships to import employers, or even tribute information if you wanted to create tributes as you are importing this data. Please let us know if you have any questions about these or any of the areas that we've discussed today, and we'd be happy to help you set up your free trial of any of our paid destinations. Thank you.